Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Harvey, and I'd like to welcome you to a joint webinar, which is hosted by ICPHSO and SPSP on the topic of ethics and product safety. I will say that both organizations, from my perspective, have always historically put on some great thought leadership sessions, and I'm very excited to have this joint session here for the first time. So ethics in general, especially from a business standpoint, can be a very broad category. This one is specific to product safety. Now, product safety as well can be somewhat of an extensive category. And for this session, that is somewhat by design. We want to cover a number of different areas. And those include touching on how the product is designed, how it is tested for safety, how is it engineered, how is it marketed, how is it monitored, and how is it recalled as well. Now, if this is a topic that has a lot of interest, we can potentially do another session where we can dive a little bit deeper and get a little bit more granular into a certain area that we discuss. So I personally deal with recalls on a daily basis. Recalls are kind of the tail end, unfortunately, of a product safety type event, but I always pay very close attention to the details associated in any type of recall announcement. And after almost 2 decades of working in recalls, I still get surprised by some of the missteps I see companies make. Sometimes consumers, I get surprised as well with some of those details that can come into play, especially around the priority of product safety. You know, where does that sit on the overall priority list? From my perspective, I think it should be really at the top of the list, and it should start from the beginning. I'm going to throw out a hypothetical recall. So let's say there's a great new push lawnmower. It's marketed as cutting, half the time down to cut your lawn. So it's super fast. Consumers love it, but it was just recalled due to an abnormally high number of incidences and injuries and property damage where objects are being thrown from underneath it, which is a fairly well-known hazard for lawnmowers, but needs to be accounted for. But this lawnmower did not meet the voluntary standards before it was manufactured and distributed. So my rhetoric question here is, should this company have thought about product safety earlier on than they did? So a lot of different things we're going to cover today. Let's go ahead and meet the panel. So today's presenters, again, I'm Chris Harvey. I am with Sedgwick. I'm also on the board of directors with ICPHSO and the EC, and I will be moderating. I will say that I am truly honored to be joined by such a talented group of speakers with a lot of expertise. So I think it'll be definitely a fun session. With that, I'll ask the panel to introduce themselves, provide a little bit of background on their history, and then some brief perspective on the topic on ethics and product safety. So with that, we'll start with Molly, then go to Karen, and then to Ken. So Molly?
Great, thank you so much. My name is Molly Linyak, and I work for ASTM International as a staff manager in our technical committees department. And for those of you who aren't familiar with ASTM, we are a global developer of voluntary consensus standards. We cover over 90 different industry sectors. And the areas that I focus on specifically are consumer products and environmental site assessment and corrective action. Specifically in consumer products, we have standards for things like toys, juvenile products, pools, playgrounds, equipment, and so much more. So when we're talking about ethics and product safety, my vantage point in looking at this is really in the development and application of standards and how they impact the safety of a product. So thanks for having me. I'll turn it over to Karen.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. I'm happy to be here. My name is Karen Hoff, and I'm the Executive Director and Chief Engineer with GE Appliances, based in Louisville, Kentucky. And in my role, I'm responsible for leading a team. We call it the Office of the Chief Engineer. And it's about 35 people that are responsible for independent technical and regulatory oversight of all of our platforms in products. So that would include any new product introductions, any changes that we make ongoing to production. So it includes not only product safety, but also energy, other regulations like material, chemistry regulations, as well as really making sure that we're launching high-performing, high-quality products. So I've been with the company almost 27 years now. I've been in this role about 6. And I will say, if you stay with the company long enough and you do enough different jobs within the company, I can say earlier in my career, I was responsible for managing a program that we launched that was very successful. And then about 8 years later, I did a recall on that product. So, I think if you stay around long enough, you start to see what the field exposure looks like, right, and see some of the that field history and how it starts to shape the direction that a company takes from there. So really excited to be here today. And Ken, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Karen. I wanted to thank ICPHSO, SPSP, Sedgwick, and of course, Chris for putting this together. I think it's a great opportunity. But by way of introduction, my name is Ken D'Entremont. I'm faculty in mechanical engineering here at the University of Utah. And one of the classes I teach is product safety engineering and engineering ethics. And I wrote a textbook that I use for that class. I also teach system safety, industrial safety, and an occupational and environmental health and safety class. All of my degrees are in mechanical engineering, and after school, I ended up doing engineering consulting with Triadine and Exponent, which was then Failure Analysis Associates. But after that, I became manager of corporate product safety at Polaris, and we made ATVs, side-by-side vehicles, snowmobiles, motorcycles, watercraft, and also accessories. And I was there for 11 years, but ultimately I left on ethical grounds. And then I moved out to Salt Lake City without employment, but eventually and slowly became faculty here. I was asked to talk a little bit about my perspectives on ethics, and at least for me, in that role as product safety manager, ethics was a huge part of what I did. And I always valued the safety of our customers. Sometimes that was in spite of their own actions. But I would always ask myself, would I let my family or other loved ones use the product I was working on? And during the 2010s, I was seeing product safety issues that I thought would become problems. And 2 of those issues I thought should have been recalls, but they weren't done till after I'd left the company. But later on, there was a good-sized fine by CPSC. But I did reach a point where I would not let my family use one of these products, so I left voluntarily. And I did pay personal and professional prices for that. However, I would do it all over again. And fortunate for me, great job, great location, life is good. But it has been a good growth experience for me and put things into even greater perspective. So back to you, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Molly, Karen, and Ken. So before we get started, just from a participation level, I wanted to mention for the audience, their lines are muted, but you can enter questions into the chat module. So I'll be watching for those questions or comments that come in. I'll try to keep an eye to see if I can bring them up during the discussion. If not, we'll definitely touch on them towards the end. If we run a little long, I know that the full group can stick around a little bit as we answer some questions. We do want to make this interactive, so I'll be introducing some polling questions to the audience. So I'll have about 20 seconds or so just to provide your selection and hit accept, and then I'll reveal the answers, and then I'll start asking some questions for the panel. I'll also mention that we are recording this session today, so if you're, no colleagues that weren't unable to make it, maybe they're in Europe and it's a little bit later, they will be able to watch it online. And then if you absolutely loved what you saw today, you're welcome to rewatch it as well. With that, we'll go ahead and get started with our first polling question. So for the audience, in your opinion, are companies doing enough to prevent product safety issues? So A, no, you think more is needed? B, yes, most companies meet the necessary standards. Or C, I don't know, which is kind of an easy out type of response if you're not sure. So again, we'll give a little bit of time for you to answer that. You know, I don't think you can prevent everything, unfortunately, but hopefully you can reduce and mitigate some things as well. So go ahead and enter your responses in. All right, I'll just give it a few more seconds. So the good news is I'm not seeing a ton of C's, so we are getting answers of at least A, no, or B, yes. So just a couple more seconds and then we'll be able to share some results here. It does look like to me that we're mostly getting A's. So again, in your opinion, no more is really needed. So that's a good thing. There are a number of B's coming through as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and move to our question for the panel. So for the panelists, what are the most important pre-market factors for preventing product safety issues? And how should companies think about safety? So first we'll start with Karen, then first we'll start with Ken, then we'll move to Karen and then Molly. So go ahead, Ken.
Thank you, Chris. I think regarding the polling question, it is tough to answer because some companies are better than others. So I'd avoid grouping custom companies together, but I think we should keep an open mind, but I think in general more can be done. But getting back to the pre-market factors, I think it's vital that engineers and product designers, get a fundamental understanding of how consumers actually use their products. And that's important before you get into the risk analysis. This is also really tough for innovative products. If you're making a product that's been made numerous times with new, simple improvements, it's probably not going to be as big of an issue. But I'd been involved in making products that hadn't been made before. And, waiting for standards or regulations is really going to take a long time. Some cases it might take 10 years in order to get that. But sometimes you may need to assemble parts of other standards to do that. But, risk analyses are important. But I think it's very important that we don't jump ahead. As engineers, if we have numbers, we want to use them. But I think taking a step back is really important so that we can do the proper risk analysis rather than assuming the product will be used a certain way. We can drill down and find out exactly how it would be used. So I think throughout this process, it's important to use critical thinking and testing to guide, our work before we make our product and release it. So with that, I'll hand off to Kieran.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I agree. And when I think of product safety, whether it's pre-market or post-market, I kind of think of it into three different areas. One is what's your business policy around that? Is that described? And then what's the organization structure? And then the business processes that support that overarching business policy. And I think the policy piece is important because that policy really communicates to employees that this is important, that it's part of your culture. It communicates, how they escalate issues, right? Who do they go to? And really sets forth the fact that this is everyone's responsibility, right? It's not just the responsibility of people that are in dedicated safety roles. So we want all engineers or whoever, any employee in the company, if they see a failure in a lab, right, something doesn't look right, how do they escalate that? And making sure that we're creating a culture that rewards that behavior. Finding problems isn't viewed as a problem, right? That's a good thing that we're finding it in the development process and not post-market. And I think part of that comes into the next piece, which is the org structure. And so if I think about my team, I'll share a little bit about how we're structured, because I do think one thing that's important is that, it's everyone's responsibility, but it's also important that you have a dedicated team that is doing safety reviews and has an independent, unbiased view. Because as a design engineer, and we've all been there, right, you think you're designing the best products. Most people have the best intentions and are trying to launch a product that meets all the requirements and is going to perform well and be safe, but they have a schedule they're trying to hit, they have a budget they're trying to hit, and so there's inherent bias there. And so I think it's important to have a team of people that have expertise in the product, but are also unbiased. So I have a team that reports into me. They don't report into the product line. They don't have schedule goals or cost goals, right? Their entire metric is protect the brand, make sure we're launching the right product and a safe product. And so they do safety reviews along the way. And I think that's important too, that you have to embed early in your process, early in the design cycle, right? And not just that you're meeting the standard, but as Ken said, especially if you're innovating, thinking about, okay, how could a consumer use this? We don't have this product in the market today. What new failure modes do we need to be thinking about? And so we, at each toll gate in our process, we do a safety review, and we have a safety checklist, but I will say that checklist is constantly evolving, because as you innovate, that checklist becomes dated, right, and is no longer relevant. And so I think you have to have that mindset too of, we have to constantly be thinking in new ways and also learning from our field experience. And, I think that helps us mitigate the risk early in the process. We do a lot of forced failure testing, for example. This is kind of the fun part of being an engineer, right? We look at ignition sources, for example. We intentionally light things on fire and see how the fire propagates. I have people on my team that love to do that back in the lab. But it's important to do that work, and then that guides the team with construction requirements that might be above and beyond the standard, right? Because you're doing something new, and you have to think about it, in a different way. And then I think the other piece of that is the business process. So as you go through that testing, how do issues get escalated, and do you have a rhythm and a defined process by which people can do that? So for us, we have a safety council. It's cross-functional. So as teams encounter issues that need to escalate, they know they can bring it into that safety council, and we can have a cross-functional discussion on, okay, how do we mitigate this risk? Or is it something where we need to pivot, right? And this is just not something that we're going to launch because whatever we're seeing here is not something we can easily mitigate. So I really think there's those three elements. You have to have a high-level policy, and then you've got to have the structure organizationally and from a process standpoint to make that policy a reality. And Molly, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, and just to reiterate what both Karen and Ken said, it's really, safety is something to be considered at the outset, right, with the initial design and concept of a product. So we would want companies to be asking at that early point on what do they need to consider for safety, or how can safety be built into the product. And then obviously as the product moves from concept and design to manufacture and use, we can do things like rely on voluntary or mandatory standards, testing and certification, and then ultimately any feedback we get from our customers or from incident data that we get from other sources to really understand how the product is used in the market, and if there's certain hazards that maybe weren't considered at the outset. But I liked what Karen and Ken both said about, safety is all of our responsibility. It's not just one of us. It's a responsibility that we all share, but I think we also share the responsibility of helping each other and sharing what we've learned along the way. So one of the stories I like to share with people is that I get a million emails all the time with random questions about products and standards. And my favorite are when someone sends me a picture of a napkin where they have a sketch of some sort of product they came up with when they were sitting in a restaurant or at home. And they'll send me a picture and say, what do I need to know? Which is a little scary, but it's also enlightening that they're reaching out. They've at least found that they need to do something. And so if it's at a pre-market stage, I think that's great, because then we can sort of shepherd them through the process and bring them into the fold. And ultimately, I think we all do have a responsibility to help each other in this way.
Thanks, Molly. And Karen mentioned, and for the full group, Karen mentioned, a corporate culture of product safety is important, really from top down. Do you feel like companies that have only been in business 5-10 years don't know that yet? They haven't realized yet that maybe they haven't learned the lessons yet. Do you think there's gaps there with companies that just haven't been around for many years?
Yeah, I think there certainly could be, Chris. I mean, for us, we've been around for a long time, right? So I think it's something that, this for us, it's ingrained. And our CEO he's a design engineer. That's how he grew up, right? So he's a product person. And so he's also has this mentality very much kind of embedded in the way that he thinks. But I think for companies that are just getting started, that might not be something that they're thinking about, right? They might be thinking about, I want a dedicated safety engineer, but they're not necessarily thinking about how do I train the entire organization and have the organization understand how important this is and the ramifications of when this goes the wrong way. And just creating that culture where I think it's so important. Engineers sometimes, especially if you're getting close to launch and you find a problem, they're stressed, right? Because they're like, okay, we're going to miss schedule, we're going to have to add product cost, whatever. And so it's very much can be viewed as a negative thing. And so in my role, that's something that I try to really recognize people and reward them for when they come in with a problem. Hey, you found this, right? You found this before the product launched. That's a good thing, right? And so now we're going to work through it, right? But it takes some time to create a culture like that.
Yeah, for sure. So on that first polling question, 56% said no more is needed and 32% yes, most companies meet the necessary standards. So majority does think that more can be done, more is needed. So with that, we'll go to our next polling question. And once we do this question on the audience screen, you should see a polling module that pops up that you can make a selection. I think we had a few put in the chat module, but just try to use the polling module. So for the second polling question, so if a company's product standard testing just barely meets the mark, is that good enough? So A, yes, it meets the criteria, nothing more should be done. B, no, companies should go beyond their requirements. C, yes, companies should explore options to go further. Or again, C, D, maybe you don't know, maybe you're not sure. Again, we'll give it about 20 seconds for you to answer that. So if a company's product standard testing just barely meets the mark, is that good enough? Yes, no, yes, but companies should explore options to go further. Or maybe you just don't know the answer as well, which is fine. So probably just another 10 seconds or so to get people to answer. All right, so we'll collect some of that data and I'll come back with you for what those results look like. For now, though, I'll go to the next question for the panel. So this next question is thoughts on the same question and why standards are important for safety. So we'll start with you, Molly, first, then go to Karen, then Ken.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I guess I would just start by saying standards are really the baseline. They're not meant to be the end-all be-all, right? They're the sort of the minimum of what should be followed. So there's nothing that says a manufacturer can't go above and beyond what's in a standard. And in cases of voluntary standards versus mandatory standards, it's sort of a misnomer because if there is a voluntary standard out there, it really should be followed. And we have to start to think about that as like a standard of care, right? When we go to our doctor, we know that there's a certain level of care that we're going to be provided with, but if our doctor wants to go above and beyond that, that's great. And it's sort of the same idea that although they're voluntary, we really should be applying them in a way that is applied by everyone across the board. But I do want to touch upon, standards and sort of the baseline requirements that are built into them. And the polling question asked if a company's product standard testing just barely meets the mark, is that good enough? And in a lot of cases, there might be a requirement and a standard, but that requirement oftentimes has a measure of safety built into it, an additional level of safety. So there really is sort of a cushion built in, and I'll give you a couple examples of that. In the children's jewelry standard that ASTM publishes, F2923, if we look at something like the cadmium levels that someone has to test for when they're manufacturing children's jewelry, the levels are actually very conservative and go above and beyond really where they need to be for safety reasons. And the reason for that is because the committee got together with the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Jewelry Trade Association, and other members testing labs, and felt like when it came to screening, they really wanted to build in this additional level of safety. And so even if a manufacturer is just barely passing the mark, there is a margin that's put in there. We also see that in things like the overload test for children's ride-on toys and toy seats. This is in our toy standard F963, where when they're looking at how much weight should be applied to these types of products, they're actually taking the 95th percentile of weight and then multiplying that by 3, so that if you had an adult or someone sit on a product, it's not going to just fall apart. And we've seen it in other things like the slat strength for cribs, where I think 60 pounds is probably safe enough, but the committee went above and beyond and made that requirement 80%. 80 pounds. So there's different ways that those sort of margins can be built in. And so I would just say, really, we hope that people follow the voluntary standards, even though they're called voluntary. We would hope that they would be followed in a way that's considered mandatory.
Yep. Thanks, Molly. Karen?
Yeah, I agree with Molly's remarks. I mean, I think in terms of if you're barely meeting the standard, it does depend, right? Because as she said, most standards do have a margin of safety that's built in. So I think this is where you need someone who really understands the standard and field history to see if you do need to go above and beyond whatever that requirement, might be. But like Molly, we often refer to them as consensus standards rather than voluntary, because we don't view them as voluntary. And in fact, I think most states and retailers, you won't be able to sell into certain states and most retailers without meeting, the applicable consensus standards. So certainly our company policy is that you're not going to launch if you don't meet the applicable standard. But I do think companies often do need to go above and beyond the consensus standard, because as Ken said earlier, these standards take time to drive continuous improvement too, right? And so as a company, as you have your own field data and field exposure, you should be using that to decide what internal requirements do we need that might be above and beyond the standard, but ensure that we are launching a safe product. And it might be based on incident data that you've seen or results in your test lab. But, we are constantly working with the standards bodies to drive improvements. And we've done that largely through our trade association, AHAM, because it's a safe place for manufacturers to do that, to collaborate. And of course, legal is present. And we don't view safety as competitive, right? So even though we're in a hyper-competitive industry, we want everyone to be safe, every consumer, whether they're buying our product or a competitive product. And so if we see a competitor have a recall or vice versa, if we have one, we'll reach out and schedule a conference call and say, hey, walk us through what happened and what changes are you making going forward. And for the most part, people are very open to that because, again, we don't view it as competitive. And so we want to share, we want to learn, and we want to drive improvements into those standards. But I think for that reason, most recalls meet the voluntary standard that were in place at the time. And so I think it's important that companies are thinking about what are the safety risks that might not be covered in the standard, and maybe longer term, how do you drive that into the standard? But that takes some time. So in the short term, what are your internal procedures and policies going to be to make sure that you address and mitigate that concern?
Thanks, Karen.
Ken, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Karen. And boy, Molly and Karen did such a great job. I can reiterate a little bit about what what I was going to say a little differently, but I view standards as necessary conditions. You pretty much, with rare exception, need to meet them. But although they're necessary, they by themselves may not be sufficient. And also, not all standards are created equally. Depending on the standards development organization, the composition of the standards committees can vary. So, so the output can vary quite a bit. And depending on different products and different organizations, some are going to produce a pretty safe product. Some will be baseline. For example, I've worked with some standards that tell you, as far as safety goes, to do this, this, and this, but there are things like don't put sharp edges on it. And it's things that a normal engineer would do. So I think there's a wide range in quality of standards. I think ASTM is pretty good. And I think the reputable companies too, easily meet and exceed those standards. But I think there's also a hierarchy and a division within industry. There are some companies that are well established, have been making this product a long time, and there are new companies that maybe don't have an established engineering team and don't have experience in that product world. So the standard is going to help the companies down here versus companies up there. For example, if I'm going to start making clothes washers, those standards are going to do me a lot more good than they would Kieran and GE Appliance. But yeah, standards are important, and I encourage people to get involved in the standards development process as well. But thank you. Back to you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. So with the polling question, barely meets, is that good enough? 56% said no, companies should go beyond the requirements. And then about 41% yes, but companies should explore options to go further. So it looks like there's a desire to do just a little bit more, maybe a lot more for some, but just more, it looks like. Okay, with that, we're going to go to our third polling question. So in today's environment, are companies adequately balancing the need for revenue, innovation, and sustainability with product safety? So A, yes, they are. No. B is no. And then C, maybe somewhere in between. So in today's environment, are companies adequately balancing the need for revenue, innovation, and sustainability with product safety? A, yes, B, no, and C, maybe. So go ahead, you should see the polling now. So go ahead and put your answer in there. So we'll give just a little bit of time here for that entry. And for me, it's interesting to see how, and I'll probably ask the panel this, how this has changed maybe, and since we're out of the main part of the pandemic, how has the environment changed? What it looked like pre, or what it looks like now? So we'll come back to that. So just a couple more seconds to respond, and then again I'll come back to what those responses look like. So our next question for the panel. What should companies be doing to balance these priorities that I've mentioned? So we'll start with Karen, then go to Molly, then Ken.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, I think this is certainly a challenge for companies because there's always something new, right, that's coming at us. And there's a lot of times there's competing and conflicting requirements, that you're trying to meet. So I can think of several examples where EPA may announce a chemical ban, but it's a chemical that you might use that is great for product safety, right? And so something that is a good change for the environment is maybe a bad change in terms of, thinking about product safety. And, I think the engineer in me, in some ways that's a good problem to have, right? It's a little bit of a puzzle to solve. And I think sometimes it can actually drive innovation as you try to figure out, how do I meet both? Because again, that gets back, I think, to the company culture where we're not going to sacrifice safety, right? But we have to meet these other regulations. And so how do we innovate to still maintain or even improve our safety posture while also meeting all this other stuff, that's coming at us? And I think this is where it's important to have the right structure in place to do that, have the right people, like the Safety Council I mentioned earlier, to do risk assessments and vet some of those ideas. And then I think specifically, as it gets into innovation, one thing that's important to consider is utility. I'm going to date myself a little bit here with this example because I grew up with this product. You may remember lawn jarts, right? And this is a product that, while it was a lot of fun, my family had a set when I was a kid. It was ultimately banned. There was no utility in that product, right? And a lot of incident data and a lot of bad accidents happening. You're basically throwing an arrow up in the air in your backyard surrounded by your friends and family. But compare that to the kitchen knife, right? It has an inherent hazard that can really never be evaded, but has a lot of utility, right? And so I think as we think about innovation, you have to think about what's the utility here, and is that utility worth the effort that we're going to have to go through to then mitigate the risk? Because at the end of the day, you still have to mitigate those safety risks while you're innovating. And so that's, I think, where it's important for companies to push themselves to not just think, hey, this is innovative, then it's creative, and therefore that's all that matters. No, it's not about balancing. It's about, I think, always keeping safety as this is important and this is the baseline. And we're going to do these other things, right? But how do we always keep safety in mind when we're doing those things?
Thanks, Karen.
And I'll turn it over to Molly.
Thanks. I did not have any lawn jarts, but I have seen them, and there are many products when you talk about utility that I can think of. They're out there, and there's lots of safety issues, and there's really no need for the products. And it's a conversation that we sort of fight about in the standards development meetings all the time. But I mean, just to go back to the sustainability piece that came up. In innovation, I mean, we see that there is an ever-increasing demand that manufacturers come out with sustainable products or environmentally friendly products or green products, right? And a major retailer that I spoke with a few weeks ago when I was talking with them about their ESG reporting requirements and how they sort of come up with their ESG program, with what sort of drove that. And a lot of it came from the demand from consumers to have sustainable or environmentally friendly products. So this is just one thing that manufacturers and designers have to consider on top of safety and revenue and everything else. So I mean, I can see that it's a demand that's just adding to it. But nonetheless, I still think that safety has to be at the forefront, because you can develop a sustainable product, but if it breaks and then presents a hazard, then you're looking at a recall or something additional that can be even worse. And so that's when, we need to start looking at things like cost-benefit analysis of a sustainable product versus a safe product, and where sort of that balance is. But I do agree with what you said, Karen, earlier about, looking at your risk assessments and starting to build some of that into that as you get going in this area. So I'll turn it over to Ken.
Thank you, Molly. Yeah, I look at it when I hear the term priority. I like to take it a little bit further, and I opened my book with a statement that product safety should never be a priority. It should always be a value. And that's because priorities change over time. They come and they go. And what you're left with are values, and values should remain pretty permanent. And product safety should be one of those. Even though there are other things going on, priorities, cost pressures, market pressures, those are priorities, and they'll work themselves out. But I think it's important to keep product safety as a value. And companies are in business to make money, absolutely. And without profits, no one's going to get paid. Taxes aren't going to get paid, and the whole system breaks down. But I believe it is possible for a company to make money ethically, and it has to be balanced with customer safety in mind. The other thing that sort of works its way into this, at least for me as a professor, is that people wonder if it's possible to teach principles, values, and ethics to adults. And I think that's sort of the wrong question. I think the right question or questions are things like this. How can a company help product designers behave ethically? Does a company encourage ethical behavior? Does it reward ethical behavior? And one important thing for workers being line workers or skilled workers, is they need psychological safety to really drive that product safety um, express train. It's vital for a healthy organization. Kieran talked about how some of her direct reports are able to report to her versus through a product group that has time pressure, cost pressure, and things like that are really good because people can speak the truth without being afraid of recrimination. And the opposite of that is that people are scared. And scared people don't think clearly and they make bad decisions. So I think that making product safety a value within a company is a vital thing for a healthy organization. So
Yep.
back
Thanks,
to you,
Ken.
Chris.
Yeah. So based on the polling questions, are companies adequately balancing the need? 48% said maybe, and 40% said no. So kind of, in the middle there. Now, I think in today's environment, post-pandemic, we have supply chain issues, labor shortages. So all of this, I think, comes into play with the balancing of that. But another additional question in this area for the panel, whoever wants to answer, how linked, how connected do you think a marketing department is, who obviously has different goals, revenue, new business, with the product safety team? So just to go back to the last slide to stay on this topic, but anybody want to try that? Anybody want to try, how linked they feel like the marketing teams are with the product safety teams? And obviously this is where you start to see, foreseeable misuse, poor communicating.
Yeah, I mean, I can take that one, Chris, as a manufacturer. I think that's probably an area where a lot of companies could improve, right? Because when you think of product safety, you don't naturally think of marketing necessarily, right? You're thinking of design, how do we control our manufacturing process, how do we monitor suppliers, right? How do we monitor what's happening in the lab? So there's a whole lot of other cross-functional areas that I think you start to think of first before you get to marketing. But I think certainly in this day and age, and we've seen it in a lot of categories where marketing will try to do a beauty shot of a product, right? And you see this photograph and it looks amazing. And then you stop and you think about it, and the way that they've photographed the product actually goes against warnings that you may have on the product, right? And so the mindset, they're thinking, how do I create this beauty shot, right? And not necessarily, okay, how is this going to be viewed, right? We're showing combustible materials on top of a cooktop, as an example, right? So it looks beautiful, but that's not how the product should be used. So I do think often we have to pull those teams in, and it's probably not most companies' natural state.
Yep, good points. Okay, so we'll jump to our next polling question. So companies can't prevent all product defects and safety issues, but are companies doing enough to monitor the safety of their products and move fast enough when a defect or a hazard is present? So the polling should pop up here shortly for that. So again, are companies doing enough to monitor the safety of their products and move fast enough when a defect or a hazard is present? So A, no, B, yes, or C, sometimes. So go ahead and answer. Go ahead and answer there. I will say I do see a couple questions coming in, so we'll make sure that we leave some time and that we're able to address those questions. So I'll just give a few more seconds for people to submit their answers. All right, with that, I will move it to the question for the panel. So what challenges exist with companies in monitoring their products? Karen, if you want to go first, then we'll go to Ken and then Molly.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a number of challenges here. I mean, one is there's a lot of data that is coming at you as a manufacturer to try to monitor your field incidents, right? Whether that's call center data, insurance claims, lawsuits, lab data, factory data, supplier data. You might have connected data, saferproducts.gov. So it's a lot of data to manage. And so I think it's really one of the challenges is creating that infrastructure, the processes and the org structure that I talked about earlier, where you've got dedicated teams looking at that data. Because otherwise you've got all this data flow coming in, but if no one's looking at it and doesn't have ownership of analyzing it and looking for trends, and there's not a regular operating rhythm by which you're reviewing it, then it's kind of all for naught, right? I would say another challenge is the quality of the data. One data source that we use really frequently is our call center data. As a consumer product company, that's a rich source of data for us. And so we have certain safety trigger words set up. So if a consumer calls in, excuse me, I'm suffering from a cold, as you may have guessed. So if I say anything crazy here, I'm going to blame the Dayquil. I may have overdosed on Dayquil a couple times today. But, so we use that data and we use those trigger words. So things like cut, fire, right? You can imagine that'll flag it and then go into a safety database, right? So that gets the safety team looking at it. But sometimes the consumer will say there's fire when there were no flames. So the quality of that data is not always the best. So you have to have other means by which you can really go validate it. So one of the things that we use is we have a field return lab. So we will try as best as we can to get components back or product back. That in itself is a challenge because the consumer, of course, the owner has purchased this product. So we want to concession the product, get it back. Some people don't want to let the product go. So trying to get your hands on it to really understand what's happening can be challenging, but really important to get higher quality data and really understand what's happening. And then in terms of, I think one of the questions that comes up is, what's the right number where you need to report something? So you've got all this data coming in, you're starting to see a trend. Is there some magic number where you should be reporting? And there's really no right number, right? This isn't, as an engineer, I think we all want to have a very prescriptive kind of formula we can follow. But with product safety, that just doesn't exist. And there really is a lot of technical judgment and looking at what's the risk. And if there's a risk of serious injury, then you need to report. And you might not have any incident data yet, but it might be a well understood hazard, right? And therefore you need to report. On the flip side, you could have a matter where you have incident data, but the severity is really benign, right? And so that's a risk discussion. So I don't think there's really a right number there.
Thanks, Karen. Ken?
Yes, Karen, you really hit that right on the nose. It's very difficult to know when you need to report or what the right number of accidents are. And statistics is a great tool and they can be powerful, but sometimes a company cannot afford to wait until they have a statistically significant number of accidents to do it. So statisticians and some managers might say, show me the data. Well, we don't want, and so big that we have powerful statistics, we need to cut that off frequently. So we're making decisions that are important decisions, but we have incomplete information. Sometimes we cannot wait until we can get that information, or perhaps some of that information will never be known. What's important, though, is that people, companies remain ethical and use those principles to make decisions. There are times when a recall is unnecessary also. So doing or not doing a recall can be a perfectly ethical thing to do once you've evaluated things. And as Kieran said, even though there are incidents, they haven't been serious. And for this reason, and that reason, we do not expect them to become serious. So it's also important that people looking at the data, avoid groupthink, where people are afraid to express a conflicting opinion. And that gets back to the psychological safety and the line of reporting as well. So, but people do need to feel that safety to upset the apple cart by voicing unpopular opinions or conclusions. And that's important when you're trying to turn all this data into actionable information. And another problem with all of this, at least from my experience, that these things will land on your desk Friday at 3 or 4 p.m. So that's the way it's been with me, but I'll pass it on to Molly.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, somehow Fridays seem to be really busy right at the end of the day. So just to sort of piggyback on what Karen and Ken said, from my perspective, it's a little different because I'm not always privy to the challenges that a company has with, monitoring their products. The way it sort of comes into the standards development process is a little different. And the way that we see that is companies who have really good systems in place to track their products and any misuse or issues that they're having could apply it to the standard. And if there's something in the standard that's not working, we can use that data to then revise the standard and make it stronger. So in most cases, and most typically, we get our incident data on products from the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission through the NICE database that they use, which is publicly available for anyone who wants to go onto their website and run their own report. But that's just one source, and that is not the end-all be-all. So we've had times where there really isn't data available in the NICE database, or we feel like maybe it's lacking. We have had manufacturers share information from their own companies that has helped aid the discussion and the development or the revision of standards. And so, the data that manufacturers collect can certainly be important in other ways, not just internally, but also for the greater good when it comes to making standards that are impactful. So I'll turn it back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Molly. All right, so we're to our last polling question and last question to the panel. So for the last polling question, do companies learn and adapt from past safety challenges so they can prevent future ones? So in your mind, A, no, most do not make the right changes that are needed. B, yes, most make systematic changes. Or C, most make temporary changes but then revert back to their old habits. So you should see a polling module pop up now. So again, do companies learn and adapt from past safety challenges to prevent future ones? A, no. B, yes. Or C, most make temporary changes and then they unfortunately revert back to old habits. So I'll just give a few more seconds for you to make your selection. All right, with that, so we'll go to our last question to the panel. So that question is, do companies learn and adapt from past safety challenges to prevent future ones? So we'll go from Ken to Molly to Karen.
Thank you, Chris. I think the companies certainly can adapt from and learn from these things. I think the polling question is there are probably some companies that fall into each of those three categories, but you can learn from safety recalls and even the close calls that you looked at, but ultimately decided were not recalls. So, but also to be clear, a close call should not be categorized as an engineering success. It's probably still a design failure. It just didn't become a safety issue. But in order to learn from these failures, a company getting back to values needs to adopt product safety as a value. Otherwise they get caught in what I call the crisis cycle, where you go from business as usual to a problem to a recall or non-recall, and then after that, the company makes a decision consciously or unconsciously. Are we going to learn from this or are we not going to learn from this? And if a company wants to learn, product safety can become a value, and it's going to take some effort and might be painful for the company, but they can break from this crisis cycle. But if a company wants to play lucky again, then they could perhaps go through this multiple times. So recalling a product once is a really bad thing, but recalling it 2 or 3 times is even worse. So learning should be made, and a company should strive to design the product properly the first time. But also when there is a problem, to admit it quickly, get out in front of it and repair it quickly. So off to
Molly.
Molly.
Yeah,
Yes.
thanks, Ken.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. So the optimist in me wants to answer yes, that companies learn and adapt, and they do everything they need to do to make sure it never happens again. But I think in reality, the answer is that it really depends. And, you know, just to go back to what Ken said about groupthink and a company's culture, it really depends on whether or not there's a commitment across the company and at all levels to make changes if something's not working. And that could be a major change, right? It could be developing a whole new department. It could be changing workflows or hiring new people. And so I think it just really depends on the commitment and the issue, you know, whether that's building in better analysis tools, whatever it is, there has to be a commitment from the top down to do that. So I'll turn it over to Karen.
Yeah, I agree with both Ken and Molly. And like Molly, I would like to be an optimist and think that most companies do respond and make systemic changes. I mean, certainly, if you've been through a recall, the cost of doing a recall, the workload of executing a recall, just the burden on the company and the brand reputational risk there is tremendous. So I would like to think that most companies take a step back after getting through that and say, okay, what could we have done differently? What did we learn? And that could be a whole host of things, right? It might be a new test procedure. It might be training, right? It might be process control in a manufacturing site. Could be a new construction requirement that we say thou shalt going forward not have this type of geometry in this location or this type of material or whatever. And so I would like to think that most companies are doing that because, as Ken said, you never want to have a recall, but often the recall is necessary, right? And it's the right thing to do. I always try to tell my team, I don't view, you know, in performance reviews, if they put on their performance review, well, you know, one of my misses was my product category had a recall. I don't view that as a miss. I view that as you did the right thing. You were monitoring the field data. You escalated it. We did a corrective action. Now, the next step in doing the right thing is how do we prevent this from ever happening again, right? Because I think in product safety, you're often looking for very low-level PPM kind of issues, right? These are not things that are staring you in the face a lot of times in the development cycle. If they were, you would have fixed it, I think. You know, hopefully most companies, right? There might be a few bad actors out there, but if you were able to find it and identify it in your development process, you would have fixed it. It's just that these are issues that might be occurring at such a low rate that despite all the extensive testing that you did, your testing didn't pick it up. So, you know, we're often having discussions within our company about, well, okay, we did this test, but do we need to do replicates, right? Or make the test more severe? What are we missing? Are we missing some environmental factor? And so I think this is a critically important area, and it's part of what I mentioned earlier. You know, I think working with the standards bodies to look at your own field learnings and partner with them in shaping proposals that can improve those consensus standards.
Yep. Good stuff. Thanks, Karen. So I know we've got about a minute left as far as the normal scheduled time. I think we're going to try to go over a little bit to answer some questions. But if we advance the slides over, I do want to just touch on some of the upcoming events so people have that on their radar. So we can go one more slide after, right here. So There is a QR code on here that you can use your phone just to be able to get more information or register. So ICPHSO has two events, the North American Product Safety Training Workshop in June, and then the International Symposium, which is in October. And then SPSP has a couple webinars, Insurance Industry Guidelines on Product Safety Efforts and International Product Safety Regulatory Updates. So if you're interested in getting more information, definitely go to these links here. It's also on the websites for ICPHSO and SPSP. With that, we'll go back a slide, and I'm hoping that we can stay over just a little bit to address some of the questions, which will also be part of the recording. So one of the first questions I see here for the panel is, what are the difficulties in going above and beyond when testing potential product misuse or abuse? Any thoughts on that from the panel? What are the difficulties in going above and beyond when testing potential product misuse or abuse? Yep, Ken?
I'll start. Depending on the company, there can be pushback because of its cost and its scheduling requirements. Some people may say, why should we do this when we don't have to? And I think that's where, the character of the company really comes out. But that would be my answer to that.
Got it. Anything to add, Molly or Karen, on that one?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that is a challenge. And we see that certainly when you're dealing with source finished goods, where you might have a source finished goods vendor that is supplying to other customers, right? And they say, well, none of our other customers are requiring this, right? And so you get a lot of pushback in that venue too. But I think the other challenge is just thinking through what are the foreseeable misuse cases, right? And one of the things that we do in all of our new product launches is we put product in the field with our employees, right? And so these are prototype units. And so it's amazing what you can learn from your own employees and their families, their kids and pets and, on, well, what could go wrong that we didn't foresee, right? So, but I just think it's tough to sometimes see around those corners, but I think that's one of the biggest challenges is just thinking through what some of those end cases might be.
Sure. Okay. A question maybe for you, Molly. Is it possible to determine when and how much of a safety factor has been incorporated into a voluntary or mandatory standard?
This is a good one. I saw that. I've been sort of thinking about it. In some cases, it's stated in the standard, right? It might be in like a note. For example, with the cadmium example I gave for children's jewelry, there's actually a note in the standard that explains why that certain level was incorporated into the testing. Sometimes we see it in footnotes. It might be a reference to the anthropometric data that we use to determine a standard and what age and weight and all of that stuff it applies to. In other cases, it's not as clearly stated. Maybe it's in the rationale of a standard, which is like a non-mandatory appendix. But a lot of these conversations really take place within the standards development meetings, and they're not always incorporated into the standard. So that's why it's important to participate in those discussions so that you can understand how the engineers in the room and the manufacturers, the testing labs, how they're coming up with certain values in testing and how they arrived at that number. So I would encourage people to get involved so they can really understand what's behind the testing requirements that we all have to abide by.
Thanks, Molly. So another question, how do you sort through hyperbole and regional grammatical variation? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I'll get it started. I mean, that is a real good question to ask, because during my time we would get comments back from a variety of people. Sometimes they've been translated from French into English, which isn't too bad. But if it comes from Arabic or something, maybe a couple people have translated it. And, exaggeration, some people may be prone to exaggerate. And that does become part of the data analysis process. Some people may not have a stake in it. Some people might have a stake in it. And there's not a simple answer to this, at least as far as I'm concerned. But, you know, if things come in and they seem incredible, you know, it's important that someone at the company, maybe depending on how it's organized. In our case, it was dealers, authorized dealers for our products. We would have them look at the product, send us photos and whatnot to try to eliminate things. But it is a real problem, and when, especially if vulnerable populations are at risk, like children, there may be that escalation of level that may be unwarranted sometimes, but you have to keep an open mind that, you know, they could really be telling the truth. So it's not easy.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Ken. All right. I think our last question here: to what extent should a company that merely sources, buys, and retails product be involved in product safety design evaluations and risk assessments, and pushing requirements onto a manufacturer that go above and beyond what the manufacturer already does for their products, especially if the retailer does not have technical staff with such expertise? Any thoughts
Yeah,
on
that's,
that?
I'll try to take that one. I kind of mentioned this earlier. It's a really great question, and I think a tough one, because it is challenging to get manufacturers, especially when they sell to multiple people and you're the only one asking, you know, to make a change. But at the end of the day, when it's your brand on the product, you have the brand responsibility and the liability. So I would not treat a source finished good any different than I would treat a product that you manufacture yourself in terms of the safety risk. Now, I think it's much, much harder to influence in a source finished good. But I think from a risk standpoint, they're the same, and from a focus, it's the same. I just think one is often more challenging than the other.
Yep. Thanks, Karen. All right, with that, I know we're about 6 minutes over, so I wanted to thank Molly, Karen, and Ken for your great expertise and the discussion. So thanks again for participating. If you liked what you saw here, definitely let us know if you want us to drill down further in potential future sessions. If there's an area, because we were somewhat broad here, if there's a particular area of interest to you, send us a message with that. But thank you very much to ICPHSO and SPSP and the panelists once again for your time. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.